It was Saturday, the 14th of March, 1885, in the city of Richmond, Virginia. Winter had not yet released its hold upon the Commonwealth, and the morning air carried a cold grey dampness that settled into the stones along the river bank and into the clothing of anyone who moved too slowly through it. The city was already stirring, carters making their early rounds, smoke rising from chimneys along the broad avenues, but near the Marshall Reservoir, at that hour, there was stillness. Lysander Rose was employed as a keeper at the reservoir, and his mornings followed a fixed routine. He walked the perimeter, checked the apparatus, attended to whatever small maintenance the facility required. He was a practical man, accustomed to solitude. It was during this routine, somewhere in the early hours of that cold March morning, that he noticed a broken shoestring lying near the fence. Nearby, a lady's red glove. He looked about him. Then he looked across the water. What Lysander Rose saw floating at the surface of the Marshall Reservoir that morning would draw thousands of people to an almshouse chapel, divide an entire city, and send a well-regarded young lawyer to the gallows, while leaving a question that Richmond could never fully answer. Fanny Lillian Madison had not been born to a life of ease, though she had been born to one of quiet dignity. She came into the world on the 27th of June, 1863, the eldest of 8 children belonging to Mr. Charles and Mrs. Lucy Madison, who farmed 100 acres in King William County, Virginia. The name given to her at birth was Fanny, but within the family she was always known by her second name, Lillian. It suited her better, those who knew her said. She was a girl of some distinction even in childhood, quick in her studies, serious in her application, and possessed of an intelligence that her circumstances might easily have smothered had certain kindnesses not intervened. It was her mother's great aunt, a widow named Mrs. Jane Tunstall of Little Plymouth, who first saw what Lillian might become. When it was agreed that the girl could come to stay and attend the public school, she excelled so readily that Mrs. Tunstall proposed paying for her education at the Burlington Academy. Lillian proved an outstanding student there also, and for a brief time it seemed that a different kind of life might be possible for her, one shaped by her own considerable abilities rather than by the limited expectations of a rural Virginia farm. But her father, Mr. Charles Madison, who had fought for the Confederate Army during the late war and held to strict ideas about the proper station of women and children, thought otherwise. He summoned Lillian home. She was needed to help with the younger children. Education beyond what she had already received was not, in his view, necessary. She returned to King William County. The relationship between them worsened. Just after her 21st birthday, she left her parents' home altogether and went to live with her uncle, a Mr. John Walker, who resided in Bath County. She subsequently obtained a position as a governess, a respectable occupation for a young woman of her abilities and situation. She was considered sociable, capable, and of sound character by those who employed her and those who knew her in the neighborhoods where she worked. By the winter of 1884, however, Lillian Madison was carrying a secret that would make her precarious independence more precarious still. During the summer months of July and August of 1884, a young man named Thomas Judson Cluverius had made several visits to the household of his uncle, Mr. Thomas Walker, in Bath County. He and Lillian Madison were cousins, their families connected through the extended branches of the Virginia kin that so often drew young people of limited means into the same orbits. Thomas was 2 years her senior, having been born on the 10th of August, in 1861. He had been educated, first by an aunt who served as his teacher, and later at the Aberdeen Academy, before going on to study law at Richmond College, from which he had graduated in 1882. He had returned to Little Plymouth and established his own practice. He taught at the Baptist Church Sunday School. He was considered by all who knew him to be a man of upright character and Christian conduct. He was also engaged to be married to a young lady named Miss Nolia Bray. Witnesses would later tell the authorities that during those summer visits, Thomas Cluverius and Lillian Madison had appeared to be very fond of each other. Nothing more was thought of it at the time. They were relations. They were young. Such things were not uncommon. On the 5th of January, 1885, the two of them had taken separate rooms at a local hotel in Richmond. The chambermaid who tended to Miss Madison's room that morning noticed that the bed had not been slept in. It was perfectly made. She mentioned it to no one in particular. Lillian returned to Bath County afterward. Then, in early March, she travelled back to Richmond, alone, so far as anyone could determine, and checked into the American Hotel. She gave her name as Miss Fanny Merton. She took a room. She was 8 months with child. She had arrived on or before the 13th of March. There were those who would later claim to have seen her that day in the company of a young gentleman. She was wearing a red shawl. She was small, 4 feet and 11 inches in height, and her condition was plainly visible to anyone who looked closely. By the following morning, she was in the reservoir. When the workman pulled the body from the water on the morning of the 14th of March, the coroner was summoned. He examined the young woman with the attentiveness that the occasion demanded, and arrived at his conclusion with some efficiency. She had drowned. There was bruising about her face, a small tear in the sleeve of her dress, but no evidence of any struggle of the kind that would have altered his judgment. She was unmarried. He noted the absence of a wedding ring. She was far advanced in her pregnancy. The coroner recorded the cause of death as suicide, and moved on to the administrative matter of what was to be done with an unidentified body. The police, lacking any means of establishing who she was, arranged for the remains to be laid in the almshouse chapel on the understanding that someone, eventually, would come forward. Word spread through Richmond, as such word does in a city of that size. The story carried from street to street, from parlour to parlour. A young woman had been found in the reservoir. She was with child. She was not known. The response was considerable. In the late decades of the 19th century, the public exhibition of the unidentified dead was not uncommon, and the morbid curiosity that drew people to such spectacles was not considered remarkable. Thousands filed through the chapel over the following days. Twice the body was identified with apparent certainty, and twice the living woman in question appeared, embarrassed but unharmed, to contradict the identification. Nothing more was thought of it. It was not until the 17th of March, 3 days after the discovery, that a woman came forward and told the authorities she believed the deceased to be her cousin, Miss Fanny Lillian Madison, formerly of King William County, most recently employed in Bath County as a governess. The police began their inquiries. They learned of her registration at the American Hotel under a false name. They learned of the reservation, the room, the night watchman. They learned of the red shawl, the hat, the bag found near the reservoir fence, items that were brought in and catalogued. The coroner, upon reviewing the accumulating evidence, revised his finding. The cause of death was no longer recorded as suicide, it was recorded as murder. The post-mortem examination of Fanny Lillian Madison yielded several particulars of significance, and the bruising observed upon the side of her face was consistent with a blow delivered before she entered the water. The fetal child she carried, a boy, as the examination determined, had not survived. Both mother and child were, in the clinical language of the period, deceased by drowning, the latter already claimed by the circumstances that had overtaken his mother. The child was removed during the course of the examination. Investigators turned their attention next to the physical evidence recovered from the scene and its environs. Near the fence that ran between a neighbouring graveyard and the reservoir, a watch key had been found caught in the paling. Its presence in that location was noted and set aside for further inquiry. It was learned, in the days following, that Thomas Cluverius had recently presented himself at a jeweller's establishment in Richmond, seeking to replace a watch key, an item he habitually kept fastened to his watch chain. The jeweller who had previously repaired a watch key for Cluverius believed, upon examination, that the one recovered near the reservoir was the same piece. From Miss Madison's trunk, retrieved from her uncle's house in Bath County, investigators drew out a poem. Handwriting experts engaged to examine the document concluded that it had been composed by Thomas Cluverius. The poem was of such a character that the Richmond newspapers declined to reproduce it. Cluverius, for his part, denied ever having written or seen it. The night watchman at the American Hotel, a Mr. William Tyler, gave a formal statement to the authorities. He said that late on the night of the 13th of March, a gentleman had arrived at the hotel and asked to see the occupant of room 19. He was told she had gone out. The gentleman wrote a note and asked that it be given to her on her return. The note was torn up when its recipient did not come back. After the identification of Miss Madison, the torn pieces were gathered and reassembled. The words read, "I will be there as soon as possible, so do wait for me." If you are finding this case as compelling as we are, please do take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We read every comment that is left, and would very much welcome your thoughts on this case. Now, let us return to Richmond, our 1885. Thomas Judson Cluverius was placed under arrest by the Richmond authorities. He was taken into custody with composure, or so it was reported, and offered no immediate statement that proved of consequence to the investigation. The evidence assembled against him, the watch key, the note, the testimony of those who had seen him with Lillian Madison on the 13th of March, the handwriting on the poem, was sealed and forwarded. A charge of wilful murder was formally laid. Cluverius was remanded to custody to await trial at the Hustings Court in the city of Richmond. The trial of Thomas Judson Cluverius commenced on the 13th of May, 1885, in the Hustings Court of Richmond, Virginia. The courtroom was filled each day to its capacity, and those who could not find seats within pressed at the doors and waited for word to come out. The newspapers had reported the case at length since the body was first drawn from the reservoir, and Richmond, divided in its opinion of the defendant, arrived at the proceedings already committed. Jury selection proved a matter of considerable difficulty. So thoroughly had the case been discussed throughout the city that it was found impossible to seat 12 impartial men from within Richmond alone. 6 jurors were eventually drawn from the city. The remaining 6 were summoned from Alexandria, some 100 miles distant. The prosecution presented its theory with clarity and force. They held that Cluverius had walked with Miss Madison to the reservoir on the evening of the 13th of March, that a struggle had ensued, that she had been struck upon the head and thrown or pushed into the water, and that her advanced pregnancy had prevented her from saving herself. They argued that the supposition of suicide, that a woman would travel from Bath County to Richmond, take a room at a hotel under a false name, and proceed alone in the dark to a reservoir in order to drown herself, was not credible. The physical evidence, the witness testimony, and the recovered note were laid before the jury in sequence. Witnesses included Dr. Thomas Stratton, who had directed a gentleman matching Cluverius's description toward the reservoir on the night in question, Mr. William Tyler, the night watchman, and a woman named Mary Curtis, who told the court she had seen Cluverius that same evening in a cigar store in Richmond, out in the company of a heavily pregnant woman wearing a red shawl, whose face was covered by a veil. The red shawl had been found near the fence. The defence challenged each element. They produced a watch key said to have been given to Cluverius by Mrs. Tunstall, distinct from the one recovered. His brother William testified to his whereabouts. Other witnesses spoke to his character. The defence also raised the question of Miss Madison's state of mind, noting that she had spoken to others of ending her life, and that a train conductor recalled her expressing a wish that the train might crash. Thomas Cluverius could not take the stand. Virginia law at that time did not permit the accused to testify in their own defence. The jury retired on the 4th of June. They returned after 40 minutes. The verdict was guilty of wilful murder. The judge sentenced Thomas Judson Cluverius to death. He received the pronouncement without visible expression. The courtroom was cleared. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court of Virginia. The verdict was upheld. A petition requesting clemency was forwarded to the governor of the Commonwealth. He declined to commute the sentence, though he did grant a postponement of the execution date. The city of Richmond remained, even now, not entirely settled in its judgment of Thomas Cluverius. Some maintained that the evidence was wholly circumstantial. Others held that no innocent man would have conducted himself as he had done on the night of the 13th of March. Others still returned to the question of Lillian Madison herself, her difficult circumstances, the fractious relationship with her father, the things she had said to friends and strangers alike about not wishing to continue. The newspapers reflected the division without resolving it. During his time in custody, Cluverius wrote a book. It was published under the title Cluverius, My Life, Trial and Conviction. In it, he recounted his early years, his education, his legal practice, and the events surrounding his arrest and trial. Throughout, he maintained that Fanny Lillian Madison had died by her own hand, and that he was innocent of the charge brought against him. As his execution date drew near, he claimed for the first time to have been in the company of a young woman on the evening of the 13th of March, a woman who could provide him with an alibi. When pressed to name her, he declined. Honour, he said, prevented him from exposing any woman to public scrutiny and shame in order to preserve his own life. It was the last statement of any note that he made on the matter. On the 14th of January, 1887, Thomas Judson Cluverius was hanged. The death was recorded. The file was closed. Fanny Lillian Madison was buried in the Oakwood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. Her son, the child who had not survived her, was placed beside her in the coffin, removed from her during the post-mortem examination, restored to her at the last. She was 21 years old. She had worked hard, studied where she was permitted to study, and made her way in a world that offered a young woman of her station very narrow margins for error. She had kept her secrets as long as she was able. The case of Thomas Cluverius continued to be discussed in Richmond long after his execution, in parlours and newspaper columns, in legal circles, in the way that cases do when they settle nothing with certainty. Over time, as those who had followed it grew old, the discussions grew shorter. The newspapers turned to other things. The reservoir is still there. The city has grown up around it. The water is still most mornings before the working day begins.